The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting an unforgiving glare across the empty folding chairs in the Riverside Memorial Funeral Home's main chapel. The scent of wilted carnations and industrial carpet cleaner hung in the air like a stubborn ghost refusing to leave even though everyone else had. I sat alone in the front row, my arthritic fingers clutching a crumpled tissue, watching the maintenance crew begin their methodical cleanup of what had been my husband's memorial service just 2 hours earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Thompson had been laid to rest that afternoon after 48 years of marriage, and somehow, in all the chaos of condolences and casserole dishes, my 3 children had managed to forget their 72-year-old mother at the funeral home. Not misplaced, not overlooked in a moment of grief, forgotten, as if I were just another piece of funeral equipment to be packed away with the flowers and guest book. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they'd left behind like an unwanted prayer card was sitting on a fortune they couldn't even imagine. My name is Margaret Thompson, though most folks have called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. I've lived in Cedar Falls, Ohio for the better part of 5 decades, watching this small town grow from a farming community into a sprawling suburb of Columbus. My children grew up here, attended Cedar Falls High School, and built their adult teat. Lives in the shadow of the water tower that still bears our family name. A donation Harold and I made back when we thought legacy meant something to the people you love most. The chapel felt cavernous now, with its burgundy carpet and cream-colored walls that had witnessed countless goodbyes. I could still smell Harold's cologne lingering faintly in the air, that Old Spice he'd worn religiously since our honeymoon, in 1975. We'd been childhood sweethearts, married young and naive, believing that love and hard work could conquer anything life threw at us. For 48 years, we'd proven that theory mostly correct. Janet Coleman, the funeral director, approached me with the careful, practiced sympathy that came with 30 years in the business. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the long day, and her black suit showed not a single wrinkle. She'd handled everything with the efficiency I'd come to expect from Riverside Memorial, the same funeral home that had buried my parents and Harold's, the place where we'd eventually purchased our own plots during a particularly morose anniversary dinner. "Mrs. Thompson," Janet said softly, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for the grieving and elderly. "Is someone coming to pick you up? I'd hate for you to be stranded here." Stranded. The word hit me like a physical blow. Here, I was, the widow of Harold Thompson, a man who'd built Thompson Construction from a single pickup truck into the largest contracting company in 3 counties. And I was stranded at his funeral because my own children had driven off without me. Rebecca had arrived in her gleaming BMW, Daniel in his restored Mustang, and Amanda in her pristine white Lexus SUV. 3 successful adults with 3 expensive vehicles, and not one of them had thought to ensure their mother had a way home. "I'm sure they'll be back," I told Janet, though the conviction in my voice was fading with each passing minute. "Perhaps they just stepped out for some air." Janet's expression softened with genuine concern. She'd known our family for years, had arranged the services for both sets of grandparents, and had probably noticed the tension that had crackled through the chapel like electricity during the service. My children had sat in the front row beside me, but they might as well have been in different time zones for all the acknowledgement they'd given me. They'd been busy networking, I realized now, using their father's funeral as an opportunity to connect with potential clients and business partners. Rebecca, my eldest at 48, had spent most of the service whispering with the mayor's wife about a potential real estate development deal. Her Thompson Hayes Realty had become the premier agency in Cedar Falls, specializing in luxury homes and commercial properties. She'd inherited Harold's head for business and my stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in negotiations, but poorly in maintaining family relationships. Daniel, 45 and still carrying himself like the high school quarterback. He'd been 30 years ago, had been equally distracted. His auto repair shop, Thompson's Garage, had grown from a modest operation into a full-service automotive center with 12 employees. During the pastor's eulogy, I'd watched him exchange business cards with at least 3 men, his phone buzzing constantly with what I assumed were work-related messages. Amanda, my baby at 42, had seemed the most affected by her father's death, dabbing at her eyes throughout the service. But even her grief hadn't prevented her from discussing catering contracts with several funeral attendees. Her business, Sweet Memories Catering, had built a reputation for elegant funeral luncheons and wedding receptions throughout central Ohio. All 3 of my children had built successful enterprises, and all 3 had done so with the assumption that their parents were struggling financially. They believed, because I'd let them believe, that Harold's medical bills had wiped out our savings. They thought the small apartment I'd moved into at Sunset Manor after Harold's diagnosis was all I could afford. They assumed that my requests for help with groceries or utility bills meant I was living paycheck to paycheck on Social Security. They had no idea about the Thompson Family Trust. The truth was, Harold and I had been careful planners. Very careful. While Thompson Construction had provided us with a comfortable living, it was Harold's investments and my own shrewd financial decisions that had built our real wealth. We'd purchased rental properties throughout Ohio, invested in emerging technologies, and diversified our portfolio in ways that would have surprised our children if they'd bothered to ask about our finances, instead of simply assuming we were poor. The lakeside cabin in northern Michigan that we'd bought 30 years ago for weekend getaways had appreciated to nearly $800,000. The commercial building downtown that housed 3 restaurants and a boutique hotel generated monthly rental income that exceeded what most people made in a year. The stock portfolio that I'd carefully managed since the 1980s had grown to proportions that would have shocked my children speechless. But perhaps most surprising of all was the life insurance policy Harold had maintained throughout his illness. Not the modest $25,000 policy my children knew about, but the $2 million policy he'd purchased 15 years earlier, when Thompson Construction had its most profitable year. The premiums had been substantial, but Harold had insisted we could afford them, and he'd been right. In total, the Thompson Family Trust held assets worth just over $2.8 million. Not enough to make us millionaires in the traditional sense, but more than enough to ensure that I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever asking my children for help with groceries again. The maintenance crew had finished stacking chairs and was now removing the flower arrangements. The beautiful spray of white roses and baby's breath that had adorned Harold's casket sat abandoned on a rolling cart, destined for the dumpster behind the building. It seemed like a metaphor for how my children viewed me. Beautiful once, perhaps, but ultimately disposable. I pulled my phone from my black leather purse, the same purse I'd carried for nearly a decade because I saw no need to replace something that still functioned perfectly. The screen showed 3 missed calls from Sunset Manor's front desk, probably wondering why I hadn't returned from the funeral. I'd told the activities director that my children would bring me home after the service, never imagining that I'd be sitting here alone at 5:30 in the evening, watching strangers clean up the remnants of my husband's final goodbye. My fingers hesitated over Rebecca's number. Should I call and remind her that she'd forgotten her mother? Should I pretend this was an oversight, a simple mistake made in the fog of grief? Part of me wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, to believe that they were sitting in some restaurant right now, suddenly realizing their error and rushing back to collect me. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger and more resentful over the past 6 months, knew better. This wasn't an accident. This was the natural progression of a relationship that had been deteriorating since Harold's diagnosis. As his condition worsened and the medical bills mounted, or so they believed, my children had grown increasingly distant. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits turned into brief, obligatory check-ins. Invitations to family dinners dried up entirely. They'd convinced themselves that I'd become a burden, an elderly woman with expensive medical needs and no resources to meet them. In their minds, They were probably doing me a favor by maintaining some distance, avoiding the awkward conversations about money and care that they assumed were inevitable. Janet returned with a cup of coffee in a disposable cup, the kind with the funeral home's logo printed discreetly on the side. "Mrs. Thompson, I've called a taxi for you. It should be here in about 10 minutes. I accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma of cheap institutional brew. "Thank you, Janet. I'm sorry to be such a bother." "Nonsense," she replied, settling into the chair beside me. "You're never a bother, Maggie. Harold spoke of you often when we were making the arrangements. He was so proud of you, you know. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known." The comment brought fresh tears to my eyes. Harold had indeed been proud of me, especially in those final months when I'd managed his care, handled his business, affairs, and maintained our household while he battled the cancer that eventually claimed him. What he might not have realized was how invisible I'd become to our own children during that same period. "He was a good man," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. 48 years, and I never doubted that he loved me. Not once. "That's rare," Janet observed. "In my line of work, I see a lot of families torn apart by grief and money. You and Harold were fortunate to have what you had. Money, if Janet only knew." The funeral itself had cost nearly $15,000, a sum that would have shocked my children if they'd known I'd paid for it entirely from my personal checking account. They'd offered to help with expenses, of course, in that careful way adult children approach elderly parents they believe are financially struggling. Rebecca had suggested a modest service at the church. Daniel had recommended cremation to save money. Amanda had volunteered to provide the catering at cost. I'd politely declined their offers and handled everything myself, letting them believe that Harold's modest life insurance policy was covering the expenses. It was easier than explaining that I could have paid for a funeral twice as elaborate without touching the principal in our trust fund. The taxi arrived exactly when Janet had promised. A yellow sedan driven by a young man who helped me into the back seat, with the sort of patient kindness that reminded me there were still good people in the world. As we pulled away from Riverside Memorial, I took one last look at the building where I'd said goodbye to my husband and, in many ways, to my illusions about my children. The drive to Sunset Manor took 15 minutes through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. We passed the house where Harold and I had raised our family, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch. I'd sold it 18 months ago when Harold's condition required more care than I could provide at home, though my children didn't know that the sale proceeds had gone directly into the trust fund rather than toward medical expenses. Sunset Manor appeared ahead, a sprawling single-story building designed to look more like a resort than an assisted living facility. My apartment there was small but comfortable, with a kitchenette, sitting area, and bedroom that met my current needs perfectly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The monthly fees were substantial, though not as substantial as my children imagined. I'd let them believe that their occasional contributions toward my rent were necessary, when in fact they barely covered my weekly grocery budget. As the taxi pulled into the circular drive, I noticed a familiar vehicle in the visitor parking area. Frank Morrison's silver Cadillac sat beneath one of the maple trees that lined the property, its owner probably waiting in the lobby with the patience that had made him one of Ohio's most trusted financial advisors for the past 30 years. Frank had been Harold's business partner in the early days of Thompson Construction, before branching out into investment management and wealth preservation. He'd helped us structure the family trust, managed our portfolio through 3 decades of market fluctuations, and served as the executor of Harold's estate. More importantly, he'd been the keeper of our financial secrets, the one person outside of Harold and myself who knew the true extent of our wealth. I paid the taxi driver and made my way through the automatic doors of Sunset Manor, my heels clicking against the polished tile floor. The lobby was decorated in soothing earth tones, with comfortable seating areas and a large fireplace that gave the space a homey feel. Frank stood as I entered, his tall frame still imposing at 75, his silver hair combed back in the same style he'd worn since I'd known him. "Maggie," he said, embracing me gently, "I'm so sorry about today. I heard what happened." Word traveled fast in a town like Cedar Falls, especially when it involved one of the community's more prominent families. Frank had probably heard about my children's oversight before I'd even realized I'd been forgotten. "It's fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. "These things happen." Frank's expression suggested he wasn't buying my attempt at nonchalance. "No, Maggie, they don't. Not to women who've sacrificed everything for their children. Not to widows who've just buried their husbands of nearly 50 years. We settled into a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the evening activities that were winding down in the community room. Frank opened the leather briefcase he'd brought with him, withdrawing a thick manila folder that I recognized immediately. "I think it's time," he said simply. The folder contained the complete documentation of the Thompson Family Trust, including financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, and life insurance policies. Everything my children thought they knew about our finances, and everything they didn't know, laid out in black and white with the precision that only 30 years of careful planning could achieve. "Harold made me promise to wait 6 months after his passing before discussing this with you," Frank continued. "He wanted you to have time to grieve, to process the loss without the complications that this knowledge might bring. But he also made me promise that I wouldn't let you be mistreated by anyone, including your own children." I stared at the folder, knowing that opening it would change everything. Not the financial reality. I'd lived with that knowledge for years, but the dynamics of my relationships with Rebecca, Daniel, and Amanda. Once they learned the truth about the family's wealth, there would be no going back to the simple narrative they'd constructed about their poor, struggling mother. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew. Frank's smile was both gentle and mischievous. "I'm suggesting that it's time your children learned who their mother really is. And I'm suggesting that tomorrow might be the perfect day to start their education." The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Cedar Falls look like a postcard. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through possibilities and consequences like a washing machine stuck on the agitation cycle. Frank's words echoed in my head as I prepared my usual breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee in the tiny kitchenette of my Sunset Manor apartment. By 8:30, I was dressed in my best navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to Harold's funeral just yesterday. It seemed fitting somehow, as if I were preparing for another kind of burial, the death of my children's assumptions about their helpless mother. I applied my lipstick with the same careful precision I'd learned as a young bride. When appearances mattered, and women were expected to look composed regardless of the chaos swirling around them, Frank had arranged to meet me at the Thompson Family Trust offices downtown at 10 o'clock. The building was one I knew well, a restored Victorian mansion that had been converted into professional offices 20 years earlier. Harold and I had chosen it specifically because it felt more like visiting a family friend than conducting business, with its wraparound porch and original hardwood floors that creaked with character. The irony wasn't lost on me that my children had never set foot in that building, despite driving past it countless times. They'd never asked about our financial arrangements, never inquired about estate planning or inheritance. In their minds, there was nothing to inherit except Harold's modest pension and whatever small savings account they imagined we'd managed to maintain through his illness. I arrived at the offices 15 minutes early, settling into the familiar leather chair, across from Frank's mahogany desk. The room smelled of furniture polish and old books, a combination that always reminded me of the library where Harold and I had spent countless Saturday afternoons in our early marriage, poring over investment guides and real estate magazines when we could barely afford groceries. Frank appeared promptly at 10, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who'd spent considerable time thinking through a complex problem. He'd been Harold's closest friend and business partner for over 4 decades, which meant he'd also watched our children grow from toddlers into the successful but increasingly distant adults they'd become. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," he began, settling behind his desk with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to pace himself through 7 decades of life. Harold was very specific about his wishes regarding the trust and your children's knowledge of it. I accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that was far superior to anything available at Sunset Manor. "What exactly did he say?" Frank opened a leather-bound folder and withdrew a handwritten letter that I recognized immediately as Harold's careful script. He'd written it on his personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with Harold Thompson embossed in simple black, letters that he'd ordered from the same printer for 30 years. "He wrote this about 2 months before he died," Frank explained. "He was very concerned about how the children had been treating you, especially after his diagnosis. He felt they'd begun to see you as a burden rather than their mother." The mine words stung, though I'd suspected Harold had noticed the growing distance. He'd been confined to bed during his final weeks, but his mind had remained sharp until the very end. He'd heard the phone conversations that went unreturned, witnessed the brief visits that felt more like obligatory check-ins than genuine concern for their parents' welfare. Frank began reading Harold's letter aloud, his voice taking on the familiar cadence of my late husband's measured speech. "Margaret has given those children everything, including the foundation for their current success. The money she provided for Rebecca's real estate license, Daniel's automotive training, and Amanda's culinary school came from her own savings, money she'd accumulated through careful budgeting and part-time work while raising them. They've never acknowledged that sacrifice, and now they treat her as if she's become a financial liability." I remembered those early years clearly. Rebecca's real estate license had cost $3,000, a substantial sum for a young family in the 1990s. Daniel's automotive certification program had required even more, including tools and equipment, that had stretched our budget to its breaking point. Amanda's culinary training at the prestigious Johnson & Wales University had been the most expensive of all, requiring not just tuition, but living expenses in a costly city. I'd worked evening shifts at the county hospital's billing office for nearly 5 years to pay for those opportunities, typing insurance claims and medical reports after spending my days caring for 3 active children. Harold had worked construction during the day and taken on weekend renovation projects to supplement our income. We'd lived on macaroni and cheese and generic groceries for months at a time, but we'd never let our children know about the financial strain their dreams were placing on our household. Frank continued reading. "If my children continue to treat Margaret as if she's a burden after my death, I want her to know that she has the power to remind them exactly who made their current lives possible. The Thompson Family Trust contains more than enough resources to ensure Margaret's comfort and independence for the rest of her life. More importantly, it contains enough to make my children reconsider their assumptions about the woman who sacrificed everything for their success." The letter went on to detail Harold's specific wishes for revealing the trust's existence and scope. He'd wanted me to wait 6 months after his death, partly to allow for grief and adjustment, but also to see how our children would treat me once they believed I was entirely dependent on their goodwill. The test had been more revealing than either of us had anticipated. He also included some specific instructions, Frank added, withdrawing another document from the folder. Harold wanted to ensure that if you decided to reveal the trust's existence, you'd do so in a way that would have maximum impact. He felt that simply telling them about the money wouldn't be enough. They needed to understand the full scope of what they'd been taking for granted. I studied the document, recognizing Harold's methodical approach to problem solving. He'd outlined a step-by-step process for revealing our financial situation, complete with supporting documentation, and suggested timing. It was the same attention to detail that had made Thompson Construction one of the most reliable contractors in 3 counties. The plan was both simple and brilliant. Rather than simply announcing the existence of the trust, Harold had suggested, inviting all 3 children to a family meeting under the pretense of discussing my financial needs. They would arrive expecting to divide responsibility for supporting their struggling mother, only to discover that their struggling mother was actually wealthier than any of them had ever imagined. "There's something else," Frank said, his expression growing more serious. "I received some information yesterday that might influence your decision about timing." He handed me a newspaper clipping from the Cedar Falls Gazette, a small article buried on page 3 of the business section. The headline read, "Local Real Estate Agency Faces Financial Difficulties," and featured a photograph of Rebecca standing in front of her office building with what the reporter described as a cautiously optimistic expression. The article detailed how Thompson Hayes Realty had extended itself too far on a commercial development project that had fallen through when the primary investor withdrew funding. Rebecca was facing significant financial pressure, with the possibility of losing her business if she couldn't secure emergency funding within the next 30 days. "She hasn't told you about this," Frank observed, though it wasn't really a question. Rebecca had always been prideful, the child most like Harold in her determination to handle problems independently. She would never admit to financial difficulties, especially not to a mother she believed was struggling with her own money problems. "What about Daniel and Amanda?" I asked, though I suspected Frank had investigated all 3 of my children's financial situations. He handed me 2 more documents, both official-looking reports that suggested he'd been thorough in his research. Daniel's automotive shop was doing well enough, but he'd recently taken on substantial debt to expand his facility and purchase new equipment. The loans were manageable as long as business remained steady, but there was little cushion for unexpected expenses or economic downturns. Amanda's catering business appeared the most stable of the 3, but even she was facing challenges. The wedding industry had become increasingly competitive, and she'd been forced to lower her prices to compete with newer companies offering similar services. Her profit margins had shrunk considerably over the past year, though she was still managing to cover her expenses and maintain a modest salary. "None of them are in immediate danger," Frank clarified, "but all 3 are in situations where financial assistance would make a significant difference. They're also all in positions where they might be tempted to view your potential inheritance as a solution to their current pressures." The implication was clear. If my children learned about the trust under different circumstances, say after my death, they might see it primarily as a financial windfall rather than recognition of the sacrifices that had made their current lives possible. Harold's plan would force them to confront their treatment of me while I was still alive to witness their reactions and, potentially, their redemption. I spent the next hour reviewing every document in the trust portfolio, refreshing my memory of assets I'd helped accumulate but hadn't examined in detail for several months. The lakeside cabin in Michigan had indeed appreciated significantly, now valued at just over $800,000. The downtown commercial building generated monthly rental income of $12,000, money that had been automatically reinvested in additional properties and securities for the past decade. The stock portfolio was perhaps the most impressive part of our wealth accumulation. Harold had been conservative by nature, preferring established companies with solid dividend histories over risky growth stocks. But his conservative approach had paid off handsomely over 3 decades of consistent investing. Companies like Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, and General Electric had provided steady returns that had compounded into substantial holdings. The life insurance payout had been deposited into the trust just 2 weeks after Harold's death, bringing the total value to $2.8 million. It was more money than either of us had ever imagined having when we'd started our married life in a rented apartment above the hardware store downtown. Frank had prepared copies of all relevant documents, organized in 3 separate folders with each child's name printed neatly on the tab. Each folder contained the same basic information about the trust, but also included specific details about how their parents' sacrifices had contributed to their individual success. Rebecca's folder included receipts from her real estate training and early business expenses. Daniel's contained documentation of the tools and equipment we'd purchased for his automotive education. Amanda's included tuition payments and living expenses for her culinary training. "When do you want to do this?" Frank asked, leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man who'd helped orchestrate dozens of similar family revelations over his career in estate planning. I considered the question carefully. Yesterday's abandonment at the funeral home had been the final straw, but I wanted to ensure that my response was measured rather than purely emotional. Harold had always counseled patients in difficult situations, advising me to consider long-term consequences rather than immediate satisfaction. This afternoon, I decided, I want to call them individually and ask them to meet me for dinner at the country club at 6 o'clock. I'll tell them I need to discuss my financial situation and future care arrangements. The Cedar Falls Country Club had been Harold's pride and joy for nearly 20 years. He'd joined when Thompson Construction began landing larger commercial contracts, initially for business networking but eventually because he genuinely enjoyed the golf course and dining facilities. We'd celebrated anniversaries there, hosted business dinners, and maintained our membership even after Harold's illness made golf impossible. My children knew about the membership, though they assumed it was one of those expenses I could no longer afford. They'd never suggested that I cancel it, but I'd noticed their surprised expressions when I'd mentioned having lunch there or attending the monthly ladies' bridge tournament. In their minds, country club memberships were luxuries that people, like their parents, couldn't justify on fixed incomes. Frank nodded approvingly. The country club is perfect, neutral territory, but also familiar enough that you'll be comfortable. Plus, it sends a subtle message about your actual financial situation before you even begin the conversation. We spent another 30 minutes rehearsing the key points I wanted to make, with Frank playing devil's advocate and helping me anticipate potential responses from each child. Rebecca would likely be skeptical, demanding to see documentation and questioning why she hadn't been informed earlier. Daniel would probably be defensive, possibly angry about being deceived. Amanda might be emotional, either guilty about her treatment of me or overwhelmed by the financial implications. By noon, I was ready to make the phone calls that would change everything. Frank offered to let me use his office phone, suggesting that calling from the trust offices would reinforce the serious nature of the meeting. I appreciated his thoughtfulness, though I suspected that by evening my children would have plenty of reasons to take me seriously, regardless of where I'd place the calls. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency she'd developed during her years in real estate. "Hi, Mom. I'm sorry about yesterday. Things got a bit chaotic after the service. Are you doing all right?" Her apology was casual, almost dismissive, as if forgetting me at the funeral home had been a minor oversight rather than a profound abandonment. I felt my resolve strengthen as I responded with careful politeness. "I'm fine, dear. I was calling to see if you could join me for dinner tonight at the country club. I need to discuss some important matters regarding my finances and future arrangements." There was a brief pause, and I could practically hear Rebecca's mental calculations about how much this dinner might cost and whether she'd be expected to contribute. "Of course, Mom. What time?" 6 o'clock in the main dining room. I've already made reservations." "Should I pick you up?" she asked, though her tone suggested she hoped the answer would be no. "That won't be necessary. I'll arrange my own transportation." After ending the call with Rebecca, I repeated similar conversations with Daniel and Amanda. Both expressed surprise at the country club venue, and both asked if I needed financial assistance with the dinner costs. I assured them that I had everything under control, a statement that would prove more accurate than they could possibly imagine. The afternoon passed slowly, each hour bringing me closer to a confrontation I'd been avoiding for months. I returned to Sunset Manor and spent time selecting my outfit carefully, settling on a black dress with pearl accessories that Harold had given me for our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look dignified and confident, not like the struggling widow my children expected to encounter. Frank had offered to attend the dinner as moral support, but I'd declined. This conversation needed to happen between family members, without the buffer of outside observers. Besides, Frank's presence might suggest that I needed someone else to speak for me, which was exactly the opposite of the message I wanted to convey. At 5:15, I called a taxi to take me to the country club. The driver, a middle-aged woman named Carol who'd driven me several times before, commented on how nice I looked and asked if I was celebrating something special. I told her I was having dinner with my children, which was true enough, though I doubted anyone would consider the evening's revelations a celebration. The country club looked exactly as it had for the past 2 decades, with its red brick facade and carefully maintained landscaping that showcased the changing seasons. October had painted the maple trees in brilliant shades of orange and gold, creating a backdrop that would have been romantic under different circumstances. I arrived early, as was my habit, and settled into a corner table in the main dining room with a clear view of the entrance. The hostess, a young woman named Jennifer who'd been working there since high school, greeted me with genuine warmth and expressed her condolences about Harold's passing. She also mentioned how much the staff had missed seeing us for our regular Friday night dinners, a tradition we'd maintained until Harold's final hospitalization. Rebecca arrived first, looking polished and professional in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people spent on clothing in 6 months. She kissed my cheek perfunctorily and settled into the chair across from me with the efficient movements of someone who had planned to make this dinner as brief as possible. "You look well, Mom," she said, though her tone suggested surprise at my appearance. "I wasn't sure how you were holding up after yesterday." Yesterday, as if abandoning me at the funeral home was already ancient history, something to be mentioned briefly and then forgotten. I smiled politely and thanked her for coming, deciding to wait until all 3 children were present before beginning the conversation that would reshape our family dynamic forever. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, his usually confident demeanor slightly subdued in the formal atmosphere of the country club dining room. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt that still carried the faint scent of motor oil despite obvious efforts to clean up for dinner. He hugged me more genuinely than Rebecca had, though I noticed his eyes scanning the menu prices with the careful attention of someone calculating expenses. Amanda was the last to arrive, rushing in 15 minutes late with apologies about a catering crisis that had required her personal attention. She looked tired, her usually perfect makeup showing signs of a long day, but she embraced me warmly and seemed genuinely pleased to be spending time together. "I'm so glad you called," she said, settling into her chair with a smile that reminded me of the little girl she'd once been. "We don't get together nearly often enough anymore." With all 3 children present, I felt the weight of Harold's letter and Frank's preparation settling over me like a familiar coat. The next hour would either begin the process of rebuilding our relationships or destroy them entirely. But after yesterday's abandonment and months of being treated like a burden, I was ready to risk everything for the chance to reclaim my dignity and their respect. The waitress approached our table, and I ordered wine for everyone. A bottle of the expensive Chardonnay that Harold and I had always shared on special occasions. My children exchanged glances, probably wondering how I could afford such extravagance, but none of them protested. As we waited for our wine to arrive, I looked around the table at the 3 adults I'd raised, fed, clothed, and sacrificed for throughout their childhoods and beyond. Tomorrow, they would know everything. Tonight, they would learn that the mother they'd been taking for granted was full of surprises they'd never anticipated. The wine arrived with ceremonial precision, the waitress pouring each glass with the practiced elegance that made the Cedar Falls Country Club feel more sophisticated than our small Ohio town probably deserved. I raised my glass in a toast, watching my children's faces as they mirrored the gesture with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. "To your father," I said simply, "and to family." We drank in relative silence, the weight of Harold's recent burial still heavy between us. Rebecca checked her phone discreetly, Daniel studied the dinner menu with the focused attention of someone calculating value, and Amanda fidgeted with her napkin in the nervous way she'd developed as a child whenever she sensed tension. "So, Mom," Rebecca began, her tone taking on the professional cadence she used with clients, "you mentioned wanting to discuss your financial situation. We're all here to help however we can." Help. The word carried such different meanings depending on who spoke it. Rebecca's version of help typically involved efficient problem-solving and practical solutions that required minimal emotional investment. Daniel's help came with good intentions but limited follow-through. Amanda's help was genuine but often impractical, driven more by guilt than actual capability. I set down my wine glass and folded my hands on the white tablecloth, drawing strength from the familiar weight of my wedding ring. Harold's presence felt particularly strong in this room where we'd shared so many meals and celebrations over the years. The mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers had witnessed our discussions of business expansion, our children's achievements, and our quiet conversations about retirement dreams that cancer had ultimately stolen from us. "I appreciate your willingness to help," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "But before we discuss my needs, I think it's important that you understand exactly what your father and I built together over the past 50 years. Daniel shifted in his chair, his expression suggesting he was preparing for bad news about debts or medical bills. Amanda reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her eyes already glistening with sympathetic tears. Rebecca maintained her professional composure, though I noticed her posture straightening as if she were settling in for a business presentation. The waitress approached to take our dinner orders, and I requested her best recommendations, ordering appetizers and entrees that would keep us at the table for at least 2 hours. My children exchanged those glances again, the silent communication that adult siblings develop when they're concerned about their parents' judgment. They were probably wondering how I could justify such an expensive meal when they believed I was living on Social Security and struggling to make ends meet. After the waitress departed, I reached into my purse and withdrew 3 manila envelopes, each bearing one of my children's names in Frank's careful handwriting. The envelopes looked official and important, which was exactly the impression I wanted to create. I placed them on the table but didn't distribute them yet, letting their presence build anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Yesterday, at your father's funeral, something happened that made me realize how fundamentally you've misunderstood both my situation and my capabilities, I continued, keeping my tone conversational despite the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. I was forgotten, left behind, abandoned at the funeral home like a piece of unwanted furniture. Rebecca's face flushed slightly. "Mom, that was an honest mistake. We were all emotional, and somehow you all managed to leave in 3 separate vehicles without ensuring that your 72-year-old mother had transportation home from her husband's funeral," I interrupted, my voice remaining calm, but carrying an edge that made all 3 of them sit up straighter. "It wasn't a mistake, Rebecca. It was the natural result of months of treating me as if I'm invisible." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle clinking of glassware from nearby tables and the soft jazz music that played throughout the dining room. I'd chosen this venue deliberately, knowing that the public setting would prevent the kind of emotional outbursts that might occur in a more private location. My children would have to maintain their composure, which would force them to actually listen rather than simply react. "That's not fair," Daniel said, his voice carrying the defensive tone I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught breaking curfew or neglecting chores. "We've been dealing with a lot since Dad got sick. The businesses, the stress of watching him deteriorate." "Yes, you have been dealing with a lot," I agreed. "Your businesses, your stress, your concerns. When was the last time any of you asked about my stress? When did you last inquire about how I was managing emotionally? Financially or practically during your father's illness and after his death?" Amanda wiped away a tear with her napkin. "We knew you were struggling, Mom. We tried to help when we could, but our own situations... What exactly did you know about my struggles? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Be specific, Amanda. What did you know about my actual financial situation, my living arrangements, my daily challenges? She faltered, glancing at her siblings for support. We knew the medical bills were expensive, and that you'd had to sell the house and move to Sunset Manor. We knew you were living on Social Security and Dad's pension, and that money was tight. We offered to help with expenses, Rebecca added. Quickly. You turned down most of our offers. I did indeed turn down your offers, I confirmed, but not for the reasons you assumed. The appetizers arrived, providing a brief interruption that allowed me to gauge my children's reactions. Rebecca looked increasingly uncomfortable, her business instincts probably warning her that this conversation was heading in an unexpected direction. Daniel appeared confused but attentive, while Amanda seemed caught between guilt and curiosity. Let me tell you what your father and I actually built during our 50 years together, I said, picking up Rebecca's envelope and sliding it across the table to her. Rebecca, you might find this particularly interesting given your expertise in real estate and investments. She opened the envelope with the careful precision of someone accustomed to reviewing important documents, her expression shifting from polite attention to genuine surprise as she scanned the first page. I watched her face carefully, noting the moment when the numbers began to register and her professional composure started to crack. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is the complete portfolio of the Thompson Family Trust," I replied calmly. Established in 1995 and managed by Frank Morrison for the past 30 years. Your father and I were very careful planners, Rebecca. Very careful indeed. I handed the remaining envelopes to Daniel and Amanda, watching as they opened them with increasing urgency after seeing their sister's shocked expression. The documents Frank had prepared were comprehensive, showing not only the current value of our assets, but also the historical growth and strategic decisions that had built our wealth over 3 decades. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with disbelief. $2.8 million? Mom, this can't be right. It's quite accurate, I assured him. Your father was very proud of what we'd accomplished together. He was also very disappointed in how the 3 of you began treating me once you assumed we were financially vulnerable. Rebecca had moved past the summary page and was studying the detailed asset listings. The lakeside property in Michigan, this, is valued at $800,000. You own that entire development? We purchased that land for $22,000 in 1994, I explained. Your father saw the potential for development before anyone else recognized the area's value. We've been collecting rental income from those cabins for 15 years. Amanda was staring at a page that listed education expenses, her catering, certification and culinary school costs itemized with mathematical precision. You kept track of everything you spent on our education? Your father insisted on it, I replied. He wanted to ensure that you understood the true cost of the opportunities you'd been given. Rebecca's real estate license, Daniel's automotive, training, Amanda's culinary education. Those weren't gifts we could easily afford. They were investments we made by sacrificing our own comfort and security. The main courses arrived, but none of us showed much interest in eating. The revelation of our family's actual financial situation had created an atmosphere that made casual dining impossible. Our waitress, sensing the tension, efficiently served our meals and retreated without her usual friendly chatter. I don't understand, Daniel said, setting down the documents with shaking hands. If you have this much money, why are you living at Sunset Manor? Why did you sell the house? Why have you been asking us for help with groceries and utilities? These were the questions I'd been prepared to answer, though I'd hoped they would be asked with more humility and less accusation. I moved to Sunset Manor because caring for your father during his final months was physically and emotionally exhausting. The assisted living facility provided the support I needed while maintaining my independence. I sold the house because it was too large for one person, and because the sale proceeds allowed me to diversify our investments. I paused to take a sip of wine, using the moment to study their faces. As for asking for help with expenses, I wanted to see if my children would willingly support their mother when they believed she needed assistance. The amounts were modest, well within all of your capabilities, and would have demonstrated that you valued my well-being above your own convenience. "This is unbelievable," Rebecca said, though whether she meant the financial revelations or my methods of testing them wasn't clear. "You've been pretending to be poor while sitting on millions of dollars?" "I've been living modestly while you've been assuming I was poor," I corrected. "There's a significant difference. Your assumptions said more about your perceptions of aging and financial vulnerability than they did about my actual circumstances." Amanda was crying openly now, her mascara creating small black trails down her cheeks. "We failed you, didn't we? We completely failed as your children." Her emotional response touched me more than Rebecca's shock or Daniel's confusion, but I wasn't ready to offer comfort yet. The conversation needed to reach its full conclusion before healing could begin. "Let me tell you about yesterday afternoon," I continued, my voice growing stronger as I approached the heart of my anger. "After you all drove away from the funeral home, I sat alone in that chapel for 2 hours. 2 hours watching strangers clean up the remnants of your father's memorial service while his widow waited for someone to remember that she existed." Daniel had the grace to look ashamed. "Mom, we honestly didn't realize—" "You didn't realize because you've stopped seeing me as a complete person," I interrupted. "I've become a responsibility to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished. You visit out of obligation, you call out of duty, and you help out of guilt. When was the last time any of you spent time with me simply because you enjoyed my company?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. None of them could answer it, which was answer enough. "The trust documents include provision for inheritance," I continued, wanting to address the elephant that was undoubtedly lurking in their minds. "But your father was very specific about the conditions under which that inheritance would be distributed." Rebecca, always the most pragmatic, asked the question I'd been expecting. "What conditions?" I reached into my purse again and withdrew Harold's handwritten letter, the one Frank had read to me that morning. "Your father wrote this during his final weeks. He was very clear about his expectations for how I should be treated after his death, and equally clear about the consequences if those expectations weren't met." I unfolded the letter carefully, noting how Harold's usually strong handwriting had become more fragile as his illness progressed. He wrote, "If our children cannot treat their mother with the respect and dignity she deserves while she's alive, they have no right to benefit from her sacrifice after she's gone." The silence that followed was deafening. My children stared at me with expressions ranging from horror to calculation, probably wondering if their behavior over the past months had cost them their inheritance. "He also wrote," I continued, "that the trust should be used to ensure my comfort and independence for the rest of my life, regardless of how long that might be. Any remaining assets would be distributed according to my wishes, not according to legal obligation or family expectation." Amanda spoke first, her voice small and broken. "Are you saying we've lost our inheritance?" "I'm saying that your inheritance was never guaranteed," I replied. "It was conditional on your behavior, your treatment of me, and your demonstration that you understood the values your father and I tried to instill in you." Rebecca's business mind was clearly working overtime, calculating possibilities and potential outcomes. What would it take to restore our standing in the trust? Her immediate focus on the financial implications rather than the emotional damage was telling, but not surprising. Rebecca had always been more comfortable with problems that could be solved through negotiation and strategic planning. "That's the wrong question," I said gently. "The right question is whether you're capable of rebuilding a genuine relationship with me based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager asking to borrow the car. "Mom, we want to make this right. Tell us how." The waitress approached cautiously, probably wondering why an elderly woman and her 3 adult children were having what appeared to be an intensely serious business meeting over dinner. I requested coffee for everyone and assured her that we were fine, just working through some family matters. "Making this right isn't about grand gestures or dramatic apologies," I explained after the waitress had departed. "It's about acknowledging that I'm a complete person with my own needs, interests, and capabilities. It's about treating me as your mother, not as your responsibility." I gathered the trust documents back into their envelopes, noting how my children watched the papers, as if they were watching their futures disappear. "Your father and I built this wealth together through careful planning, hard work, and significant sacrifice. We did it to ensure our own security and to provide opportunities for our children. But we never intended for it to become a source of entitlement or a substitute for genuine family relationships." Amanda reached across the table again, this time grasping my hand with both of hers. "How do we start over, Mom? How do we prove that we can be better?" Her question gave me hope, though I wasn't ready to make anything easy for them yet. "You start by acknowledging what happened yesterday and taking responsibility for the pattern of behavior that led to it. You continue by making time for me in your lives, not because you feel obligated, but because you value our relationship." Rebecca had been unusually quiet, probably processing the financial implications and strategic possibilities. When she finally spoke, her words surprised me with their directness. "We've been terrible children, haven't we? Not just recently, but for years. We've taken you for granted and assumed you would always be there, available and grateful for whatever scraps of attention we threw your way." Her acknowledgement was more honest than I'd expected, and it began to crack the protective armor I'd built around my heart over the past months. "Your father and I raised you to be independent and successful," I said. "We're proud of what you've accomplished in your careers and your businesses. But success without compassion is meaningless, and achievement without family connection is, ultimately, hollow." The coffee arrived, providing another brief respite that allowed us all to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. I studied my children's faces, seeing echoes of the toddlers, school children, and teenagers they'd once been. Somewhere underneath their adult preoccupations and self-absorption were the loving, curious, generous people I'd raised them to become. "There's something else you should know," I said, deciding to complete the evening's revelations. "Frank Morrison has been managing our investments for 30 years, but he's ready to retire. The trust needs new management, and your father suggested that our children might be interested in taking over that responsibility." Daniel looked up sharply. "You're offering us control of the trust?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to earn it," I corrected. "The trust will need competent management for potentially another 20 or 30 years, depending on my longevity. It could provide an income stream for whoever accepts that responsibility, but it would also require a genuine commitment to understanding and honoring your father's wishes." Rebecca's business instincts were clearly engaged now. "What kind of fee? Of management fee are we talking about?" "The same percentage Frank has been earning," I replied. 2% annually, plus performance bonuses based on growth targets. Last year, that would have amounted to approximately $56,000. The number hung in the air like a golden carrot, substantial enough to solve Rebecca's current business difficulties, or provide security for Daniel's expansion plans, or cushion Amanda's profit margins. But I could see in their faces that they were beginning to understand the strings attached to such an opportunity. The management position would require monthly meetings with me to review performance and discuss strategy, I continued. It would also require annual family gatherings to maintain the relationships that the trust was designed to protect. Your father was very specific about wanting the money to bring the family together, not drive us apart. Amanda was the first to make the connection. You're offering us a way to rebuild our relationship while solving our financial problems. I'm offering you a way to prove that you're capable of both, I agreed. The question is whether you're interested in putting in the effort required to earn it. As we sat in the elegant dining room of the Cedar Falls Country Club, surrounded by the trappings of the success Harold and I had worked so hard to achieve, I felt a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for the months of distance and misunderstanding that had brought us to this point, but hope that my children might still be capable of growing into the adults I'd always believed they could become. The evening was far from over, and tomorrow would bring new challenges as we all adjusted to this dramatically altered family dynamic. But for the first time since Harold's diagnosis, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny rather than simply reacting to other people's assumptions about what that destiny should be. The silence that settled over our table was broken by the distant sound of piano music from the club's lounge, a melancholy melody that seemed to underscore the weight of everything that had been revealed. My children sat like statues, each processing the enormity of their miscalculations in their own way. The trust documents lay between us like a bridge between two different realities, the one they'd constructed based on assumptions, and the one that actually existed. Rebecca was the first to break the stillness, her voice carrying a tremor that betrayed her usual confidence. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, prepared for whatever question she might pose. Throughout the evening, I'd committed myself to absolute transparency, recognizing that half-truths and gentle deceptions had contributed to our current estrangement. When you asked us for help with groceries and utilities over the past year, were you testing us? Were you deliberately creating situations to see how we'd respond? The question struck at the heart of my methodology, and I appreciated Rebecca's directness even as I recognized the accusation implicit in her words. "Yes and no," I replied carefully. The requests were real in the sense that I could have used the assistance, though not because I couldn't afford those expenses myself. I was testing whether my children cared enough about my well-being to make small sacrifices for my comfort. Daniel's face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "So, you were manipulating us? Setting up scenarios where we were bound to fail some test we didn't even know we were taking?" His reaction was predictable but still disappointing. Even faced with evidence of his own neglect, Daniel's instinct was to position himself as the victim of my alleged deception rather than acknowledging his failure to prioritize his mother's needs. "I was giving you opportunities to demonstrate the values your father and I tried to teach you," I corrected, keeping my voice level despite my growing frustration. "When you were children and asked for money for school trips or new clothes, did you consider those requests to be manipulation? Or did you see them as legitimate needs that loving parents would try to meet?" Amanda had been unusually quiet since our conversation began, but now she looked up with tears still streaking her cheeks. "The difference is that we were children, then, and you knew we needed those things. You're our mother. You're supposed to be the one taking care of us, not the other way around." Her words revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had poisoned our relationships over the past year. "Amanda, when exactly did you decide that the parent-child relationship becomes entirely one-directional? At what age did you determine that your mother no longer deserves consideration or care?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, forcing all three of them to confront the selfishness that had characterized their treatment of me since Harold's illness began. I'd spent decades prioritizing their needs above my own, sacrificing my comfort for their opportunities, yet they'd somehow convinced themselves that reaching adulthood absolved them of any reciprocal responsibility. Frank Morrison appeared at our table with the perfect timing that comes from decades of experience in delicate family situations. He'd been dining alone in the far corner of the restaurant, positioned where he could observe our conversation without intruding, ready to provide support if the situation required intervention. "Good evening, Rebecca, Daniel, Amanda," he said, his tone pleasantly professional. I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to express my condolences on your father's passing. Harold was one of the finest men I've ever known. My children's reactions to Frank's appearance were telling. Rebecca immediately straightened in her chair, her business instincts recognizing someone of importance. Daniel looked confused, probably wondering why a stranger felt comfortable approaching our family table. Amanda simply appeared grateful for any interruption that might relieve the tension. "Frank Morrison," he said, extending his hand to each of them in turn. "I've been managing your parents' financial affairs for the past 30 years. Your mother asked me to stop by this evening in case you had any questions about the trust documentation." The introduction clarified his role and authority, transforming him from an intrusive stranger into a crucial witness to our family's financial reality. Rebecca, always quick to recognize networking opportunities, was the first to engage him, professionally. "Mr. Morrison, could you help us understand the timeline of these investments? When did my parents begin accumulating this level of wealth?" Frank settled into the empty chair between Amanda and Daniel, his presence somehow making our family crisis feel more manageable. "Your parents began serious wealth building in the early 1990s, though they'd been investing modestly since their marriage. The real acceleration came when Thompson Construction started landing those larger commercial contracts around 1995. He gestured toward the trust documents that still lay scattered across our table. "Your father was remarkably disciplined about reinvesting profits rather than upgrading your family's lifestyle. Most contractors who experience that level of success immediately purchase larger homes, expensive vehicles, luxury vacations." Harold and Margaret continued living in the same house, driving practical cars, and taking modest family trips while systematically building their investment portfolio. I remembered those years clearly, the tension between wanting to provide more luxuries for our children and Harold's insistence that we prioritize long-term security over immediate gratification. We'd watched other successful couples upgrade their lifestyles dramatically, only to struggle financially when construction markets inevitably fluctuated. "They made sacrifices you never knew about," Frank continued, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed our financial decisions firsthand. "The year Rebecca started college, your parents could have afforded a much larger house, or that European vacation Margaret had always wanted. Instead, they purchased the first of their rental properties and established the education fund that eventually paid for all 3 of your professional training." Amanda reached for the documents, again studying the education expenses with new understanding. "You tracked every penny you spent on us." "Your father insisted on it," I confirmed. "He wanted documentation of our investment in your futures, partly for tax purposes, but mostly because he believed you should understand the true cost of your opportunities." Frank nodded approvingly. "Harold often said that children who don't understand the value of their advantages are likely to squander them. He wanted you to know that your education and business startup costs represented real sacrifices, not casual gifts." Rebecca had been reviewing the property listings, her real estate expertise allowing her to appreciate the portfolio's sophistication. The Michigan Lakeside development, the downtown commercial building, the Westerville apartment complex, these are substantial holdings. The rental income alone must be significant. "Approximately $18,000 monthly," Frank confirmed. "Your parents could have lived quite comfortably on that income alone, without touching the principal or the stock portfolio returns." The magnitude of our financial security was clearly overwhelming my children, who'd spent months assuming I was struggling to survive on Social Security payments. Daniel shook his head in apparent disbelief, while Amanda continued dabbing at her eyes with increasingly soggy napkins. "I have a question that might be difficult," Daniel said, looking directly at me rather than Frank. "If you had this much financial security, why didn't you tell us? Why let us worry about your well-being when you were perfectly capable of taking care of yourself?" The question struck to the heart of our family's dysfunction, and I appreciated Daniel's willingness to ask it directly, rather than continuing to dance around the obvious issues. "Because your worry about my well-being was largely theoretical," I replied honestly. "You worried about the idea of me struggling, but you didn't actually do anything meaningful to address those concerns. Your occasional contributions toward my expenses were minimal compared to your capabilities, and your emotional support was virtually non-existent." Frank cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may add some perspective, your parents discussed this decision extensively over the past 2 years. Harold was particularly concerned about what he called inheritance syndrome, the tendency for adult children to become emotionally distant once they know substantial wealth exists." He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind of careful record-keeping that had made him successful in financial management. "Harold specifically worried that knowledge of the trust might make you feel entitled to financial support, rather than motivated to build genuine relationships with your mother." "So this was all planned?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure whether she was impressed or offended by our strategic thinking. "The financial structure was planned," I clarified. "Your father and I spent years building security for our family's future. But your treatment of me over the past months was entirely your choice, and it revealed character traits that disappointed both of us profoundly." Amanda looked stricken. "We failed the test, didn't we? We proved that we're exactly the kind of selfish children Dad was worried we'd become." Her recognition of our disappointment was painful, but necessary. "You proved that you need to re-examine your priorities and your understanding of family responsibility," I said gently. "But failure isn't permanent unless you refuse to learn from it." Frank consulted his notebook again. "Harold left specific instructions about redemption opportunities. He believed strongly in second chances, but only for people willing to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to meaningful change." The word redemption seemed to resonate with all 3 of my children, suggesting that despite their recent failures, they retained some capacity for growth and self-reflection. Rebecca leaned forward with the focused attention she typically reserved for important business negotiations. "What kind of commitment would be required?" she asked. Frank looked to me for permission before answering, recognizing that this conversation was ultimately about family relationships rather than financial management. I nodded, ready to hear Harold's wishes articulated by someone other than myself. "Harold outlined a 2-year probationary period during which your relationships with your mother would be carefully evaluated. Monthly family dinners, weekly phone calls that focus on her interests rather than your needs, inclusion in major family decisions and celebrations. Basically, treating her like a valued family member rather than an obligation." The requirements sounded reasonable enough, though I suspected my children were beginning to understand that genuine relationship building would require more effort than they'd been investing in our family connections for years. "During this probationary period," Frank continued, "the trust management opportunity would be available to whichever child demonstrates the most consistent commitment to the family relationships Harold valued. The position comes with significant financial compensation, but also with substantial responsibility for your mother's long-term security." Daniel asked the practical question I'd been expecting. "What happens if we don't meet the requirements? What happens to the money?" Frank's expression grew more serious. "Harold and Margaret established a charitable foundation as an alternative beneficiary. If the family relationships can't be rebuilt, the trust assets will be donated to organizations that support music education and senior services, causes that reflect your parents' values and interests." The threat of losing their inheritance to charity was subtle, but unmistakable. Harold had understood that financial incentives alone wouldn't rebuild our family bonds, but he'd also recognized that the possibility of losing substantial wealth might motivate behavior changes that could eventually lead to genuine relationship improvements. "How much time do we have to decide?" Amanda asked, her voice small and uncertain. "The probationary period begins whenever you're ready to commit to it," I replied. "But it requires genuine effort, not just going through the motions. Your father and I were very specific about wanting authentic relationships, not performances designed to secure inheritance rights. Rebecca had been unusually quiet during Frank's explanations, but now she looked up with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager grappling with a particularly challenging problem. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if it hurts my feelings." I braced myself for whatever revelation might be coming, recognizing that Rebecca's business acumen often led her to insights that her siblings missed. "Do you actually want relationships with us anymore? Not because you're lonely or because Dad expected it, but because you genuinely enjoy our company and want us in your life?" The question was more perceptive than I'd anticipated, forcing me to examine my own motivations and desires rather than simply focusing on my children's failures. Did I want them in my life because I loved them or because I felt obligated to maintain family connections regardless of how those relationships made me feel? "I want relationships with the adults you're capable of becoming," I answered carefully. "I'm not interested in continuing the patterns we've established over the past year, where I exist primarily as a source of guilt and obligation. But I believe you're all capable of growth and change, or I wouldn't have agreed to Harold's redemption plan." Frank began gathering his papers, recognizing that the conversation had reached a natural transition point. "I'll leave you to discuss this as a family. Margaret has my contact information if you have questions about the financial details, and I'm prepared to facilitate the trust management transition whenever you're ready." After Frank departed, we sat in contemplative silence while the dining room gradually emptied around us. The evening crowd was giving way to the late-night bar patrons, and our waitress had begun stacking chairs in the adjacent dining areas. We'd been talking for nearly 3 hours, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. Longer because of the emotional intensity, shorter because we'd barely scratched the surface of the issues that needed resolution. "I have something I need to tell you all," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. "My business is in serious trouble. I'm facing potential bankruptcy within the next month unless I can secure emergency funding." Her admission surprised me, though Frank's earlier research had suggested that all 3 of my children were facing financial pressures. Rebecca's willingness to share her vulnerability represented a departure from the image management that had characterized her interactions with family for the past several years. The commercial development deal that fell through last month, I'd extended my company's credit beyond safe limits because the profit potential was enormous. When the primary investor withdrew, I was left with obligations I can't meet from current cash flow. Daniel and Amanda exchanged glances, probably recognizing similar patterns in their own business decisions. Success had made them confident, perhaps overconfident, about their ability to manage risk and weather financial storms. "How much do you need?" I asked, though I suspected that my offer to help would be met with the same pride that had prevented her from asking for assistance earlier. $200,000, she replied, the number coming out in a rush, as if saying it quickly might reduce its impact. Enough to cover the immediate obligations and provide working capital while I rebuild client confidence. The amount was substantial but well within our trust's capacity, representing less than 7% of our total assets. More importantly, it represented an opportunity for Rebecca to acknowledge her need for family support, and for me to demonstrate that financial assistance was available for children who treated me with respect and inclusion. I could provide that funding, I said calmly, but not as a gift or a traditional loan. It would need to be structured as an investment in your business, with terms that protect the trust's interests and ensure accountability for how the money is used. Rebecca's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You'd actually consider helping me?" "I'd consider investing in a business run by my daughter, assuming that daughter was committed to rebuilding our relationship and including me in her life in meaningful ways." The conditional nature of my offer wasn't lost on any of them. Help was available, but it came with expectations about family dynamics that went far beyond simple financial transactions. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. I'm in a similar situation, though not quite as dire. The expansion loan for my shop is straining my cash flow more than I'd anticipated. I've been considering asking for family assistance, but I assumed you couldn't afford to help. And I've been struggling with profit margins in a competitive market, Amanda added. I'd convinced myself that asking you for business advice or financial help would be adding to your stress during an already difficult time. The irony of their assumptions was striking. All three of my children had been struggling with business challenges, while simultaneously assuming that their mother was the one who needed financial assistance. They'd created a narrative of family dynamics that bore no resemblance to our actual circumstances, then made decisions based on those false assumptions. Help has always been available, I said gently. But help requires relationship. It requires trust and communication and mutual respect. Those are the things your father and I tried to build with you over the years, and those are the things that will determine whether our family survives the next generation. As we finally prepared to leave the country club, my children seemed subdued and thoughtful in ways I hadn't observed in years. The revelations of the evening had shattered their comfortable assumptions about family roles and financial realities, forcing them to confront both their failures and their opportunities for redemption. The valet brought my taxi while Rebecca, Daniel, and Amanda stood awkwardly in the club's entrance, probably uncertain about how to end such an unprecedented conversation. For the first time in months, I felt like I was looking at my children rather than at strangers who happened to share my DNA. Think about everything we've discussed tonight, I told them as I prepared to leave. Think about the kind of relationships you want to have with me for the rest of my life, and think about the kind of people you want to be. The trust will be here regardless of your decisions, but the opportunity to rebuild our family won't last forever. As the taxi pulled away from the country club, I watched my three children standing together in the golden light spilling from the building's windows. For the first time in months, they were talking to each other with animated gestures and serious expressions, probably beginning the process of understanding how dramatically their world had changed in the span of a single evening. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight had accomplished what Harold and I had hoped for. It had forced our children to confront their assumptions, acknowledge their failures, and consider the possibility that their mother was more than the dependent burden they'd imagined her to be. 3 months had passed since that transformative dinner at the Cedar Falls Country Club, and I was sitting in my favorite armchair at the lakeside cabin in northern Michigan, watching the morning sun paint golden ripples across the water. The peace I felt was earned rather than given, the result of difficult conversations, honest confrontations, and the slow rebuilding of relationships I'd thought might be lost forever. The cabin had become my primary residence, a decision that had surprised everyone, including myself. After decades of Ohio living, the idea of relocating to Michigan at 72 had seemed impractical, even reckless. But the isolation and natural beauty of the property provided exactly the kind of restorative environment I needed to process Harold's death and navigate the complex emotions surrounding my children's transformation. Frank Morrison had handled the transition with his characteristic efficiency, arranging for my belongings to be moved from Sunset Manor and establishing local banking relationships and medical services. The cabin's previous status as a rental property meant it was already furnished and equipped for comfortable living, though I'd added personal touches that made it feel more like home than temporary accommodation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda, a daily occurrence that still surprised me with its consistency. "Good morning, Mom. Catering a wedding today, but wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. The bride specifically requested your famous apple cinnamon muffin recipe. Hope you don't mind that I shared it." The message made me smile, remembering how Amanda had always been my most enthusiastic kitchen helper as a child. Her catering business had stabilized considerably over the past 3 months, partly due to the $25,000 investment I'd made in new equipment and marketing, but mostly because of her renewed confidence and creativity. Our weekly baking sessions via video call had become a highlight of both our weeks, combining business mentorship with the kind of mother-daughter bonding we'd lost somewhere in the chaos of her adult responsibilities. Rebecca had been the most challenging of my children to reconnect with, her natural pride and business instincts making vulnerability difficult even when the stakes were clearly defined. The $200,000 investment in Thompson Hayes Realty had been structured as a formal business partnership, with monthly performance reviews and quarterly strategic planning sessions that forced us to communicate regularly about both professional and personal matters. Initially, our meetings had been stilted and awkward, Rebecca treating me more like a demanding investor than her mother. But gradually, as her business stabilized and her confidence returned, she'd begun asking for advice about matters beyond simple financial management. Last week, she'd called to discuss a potential romantic relationship with someone she'd met through work, the first time in years that she'd sought my perspective on her personal life. Daniel's transformation had been the most dramatic of the three, perhaps because his mechanical aptitude and practical nature made him naturally suited to direct action rather than prolonged introspection. Within 2 weeks of our country club confrontation, he'd driven to Michigan to spend a long weekend helping me settle into the cabin, installing safety features and making minor repairs that improved both functionality and comfort. His automotive shop had received a $30,000 infusion for equipment upgrades and inventory expansion. But more importantly, he'd begun including me in family decisions and celebrations that I'd been excluded from for months. His wife, Sarah, had become an unexpected ally in rebuilding our relationship, apparently having felt guilty about her husband's neglect, but uncertain about how to address it without creating marital tension. The probationary period Frank had outlined was progressing better than I'd dared to hope, though not without occasional setbacks and misunderstandings. Family dynamics that had been damaged over months couldn't be repaired overnight, and each of my children struggled with different aspects of treating me as a complete person rather than a responsibility to be managed. A knock on the cabin's front door interrupted my morning reflection, and I was surprised to see Frank Morrison standing on the wraparound porch with a briefcase and an expression that suggested important business. He'd made the drive from Cedar Falls specifically to see me, which typically meant significant developments in either trust management or family dynamics. "Margaret," he said, embracing me warmly as I invited him inside. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I have some news that I thought you'd want to hear in person rather than over the phone." He settled into the leather chair across from mine, accepting coffee from the pot I kept constantly brewing during the cooler autumn months. The cabin's great room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the lake views Harold and I had fallen in love with 30 years earlier, providing a backdrop that made even serious conversations feel more manageable. "I've been reviewing the children's progress over the past 3 months," Frank began, opening his briefcase to withdraw 3 thick folders. Harold's requirements for the probationary period were quite specific, and I think you'll be pleased with what I've documented. He handed me Rebecca's folder first, noting that she'd exceeded the minimum requirements for family contact and had begun including me in business decisions that went beyond our formal investment partnership. More significantly, she'd started asking about my interests and activities rather than simply updating me on her own professional developments. Last week, she called me to ask about planning a memorial garden for Harold at the family cemetery plot. Frank continued. "She wants to involve you in the design process and make it a collaborative project rather than something she handles independently." The gesture touched me deeply, representing exactly the kind of thoughtful inclusion that Harold's redemption plan had been designed to encourage. Rebecca's natural tendency to take charge of situations had often meant that other family members became passive observers rather than active participants, but she was clearly making conscious efforts to change those patterns. Daniel's folder contained documentation of his weekly visits to the cabin, often bringing his teenage son Marcus to help with outdoor maintenance projects that kept the property in excellent condition. More importantly, these visits had evolved from obligatory check-ins to genuine family time, with conversations ranging from business advice to personal reflection about his father's influence on his values and priorities. Daniel asked me to discuss the possibility of building a workshop on your property, Frank said with a knowing smile. Apparently, he's been missing the woodworking hobby he shared with Harold, and he thinks working on projects here might be therapeutic for both of you. The idea appealed to me enormously, though not simply because it would provide additional opportunities for family bonding. Harold had been a skilled woodworker, and his absence had left a creative void that I hadn't known how to address. Having Daniel continue that tradition while building our relationship seemed like exactly the kind of healing activity that would honor Harold's memory while serving our current needs. Amanda's folder was the thickest of the three, filled with documentation of daily text messages, weekly video calls, and monthly visits that had become increasingly comfortable and natural. Her emotional intelligence had always been her greatest strength, and she'd channeled that ability into rebuilding our relationship with remarkable sensitivity and persistence. Amanda has been researching senior-friendly travel options, Frank noted. She's apparently planning a surprise trip for your birthday, somewhere Harold always wanted to take you, but never had the opportunity. The thoughtfulness of such a gesture overwhelmed me with gratitude and hope. Amanda had always been my most emotionally connected child, but her busy schedule and adult responsibilities had created distance that I'd assumed was permanent. Her commitment to rebuilding our bond had been both consistent and creative, demonstrating that she understood the difference between obligatory contact and genuine relationship building. Frank closed the folders and leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting satisfaction with positive developments he'd helped orchestrate. All three children have exceeded Harold's minimum requirements for family engagement. But more importantly, they've demonstrated authentic commitment to changing their behavior, rather than simply going through motions to secure inheritance rights. The distinction was crucial, representing the difference between temporary compliance and lasting transformation. Harold's plan had been designed to encourage genuine growth rather than superficial behavior modification, and Frank's assessment suggested that our children had risen to meet that challenge. "There's something else," Frank continued, reaching into his briefcase again. "I received a letter yesterday that I think you'll find interesting." He handed me an envelope addressed to Mrs. Margaret Thompson, in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. The return address indicated it was from Westerville College, a small liberal arts institution about an hour south of Cedar Falls. Inside was a formal letter from the college's development office, explaining that they'd learned about my musical background and interest in senior education programs. They were requesting a meeting to discuss the possibility of establishing a music therapy program specifically designed for older adults dealing with grief and life transitions. "Apparently, your children have been talking about your interests and expertise to people in their professional networks," Frank explained. "Rebecca mentioned your piano background to a client who serves on Westerville's Board of Trustees. That conversation led to research about your teaching experience and, ultimately, to this invitation. The opportunity intrigued me greatly, representing a chance to use my musical training and personal experience with loss to help others navigate similar challenges. More importantly, it demonstrated that my children had begun thinking of me as someone with valuable skills and knowledge, rather than simply as their aging mother who needed care and management. The position would be part-time and flexible," Frank continued, "designed around your schedule and energy levels. But it would provide both income and purpose, along with the kind of professional recognition that Harold always felt you deserved." I studied the letter more carefully, noting that the proposed program would serve both college students dealing with family losses and community seniors facing various life transitions. The combination of generations appealed to me, offering opportunities to share wisdom while learning from younger perspectives. "I'd like to explore this opportunity," I decided, feeling excited about possibilities I hadn't considered since Harold's death. "But I'd also like to involve my children in the decision-making process, get their input about timing and logistics." Frank's approval was evident in his expression, That's exactly what Harold hoped would happen, that you'd begin making decisions collaboratively rather than either independently or deferentially. The conversation shifted to trust management, the financial opportunity that had served as both carrot and stick throughout the family reconciliation process. All 3 children had expressed interest in the position, but Frank's assessment suggested that Daniel was emerging as the most suitable candidate. Rebecca's business expertise is valuable, but her tendency to prioritize financial returns over relationship maintenance makes her less ideal for managing a family trust, Frank explained. Amanda's emotional intelligence is excellent, but she lacks the technical knowledge that complex investment management requires. Daniel's combination of practical skills, growing emotional maturity, and genuine commitment to family relationships had made him the obvious choice, though Frank had been careful to discuss the decision with all 3 children to ensure that competitive dynamics didn't undermine their collaborative progress. Daniel understands that managing the trust isn't just about investment returns, Frank continued. It's about preserving the family connections and values that Harold and you worked so hard to build. He's also committed to transparent communication with his siblings about trust performance and distributions. The management transition would occur over 6 months, with Frank providing training and oversight to ensure continuity and competence. Daniel would receive the same compensation Frank had earned, but he'd also inherit the responsibility for maintaining family harmony while preserving the trust's growth and security. "There's one more matter we need to discuss," Frank said, his tone becoming more serious. Harold included specific provisions for situations where family relationships improved beyond his minimum expectations. The trust document allows for additional distributions to recognize exceptional commitment to family reconciliation. He withdrew another document from his briefcase, this one bearing Harold's signature and my own from several years earlier, when we'd finalized the trust structure. The provision Frank referenced allowed for discretionary distributions of up to 10% of the trust's value to children who demonstrated extraordinary dedication to family relationships and personal growth. "All 3 children have exceeded expectations," Frank continued, "but they've also incurred business expenses and made personal sacrifices to prioritize family rebuilding. Harold anticipated that genuine reconciliation might require financial recognition beyond simple inheritance protection. The additional distributions would amount to approximately $90,000 for each child, substantial enough to address their business challenges while rewarding their commitment to family relationships. More importantly, the distributions would come during my lifetime, allowing me to witness their gratitude and continued growth rather than simply providing posthumous benefits. I'd like to announce these distributions at Thanksgiving dinner," I decided, thinking ahead to the holiday celebration Amanda was planning at the cabin. "It seems appropriate to express gratitude for family reconciliation during a season specifically dedicated to thankfulness." Frank nodded approvingly, probably recognizing that the timing would maximize both emotional impact and family bonding opportunities. Harold would be pleased with how this has developed. He always believed that money should strengthen family relationships rather than complicate them. After Frank departed, I spent the afternoon walking along the lake shore, reflecting on the journey that had brought me from abandonment at Harold's funeral to renewal at this peaceful retreat. The transformation had required courage I hadn't known I possessed, along with willingness to risk losing my children entirely in order to reclaim my dignity and their respect. The evening brought a video call with all 3 children, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally from our monthly dinner requirements. These conversations had become highlights of my week, offering opportunities to share experiences, provide advice, and maintain connections that distance might otherwise weaken. Rebecca appeared on screen first, calling from her renovated office, space that showcased both professional success and the family photographs she'd begun displaying prominently. "Mom, I have some exciting news about the Memorial Garden project. The landscape architect presented 3 design options, and I'd love to review them with you this weekend." Her enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, representing a complete reversal from the distant professionalism that had characterized our interactions for months. The memorial garden had become a collaborative project that honored Harold's memory while providing opportunities for ongoing mother-daughter bonding. Daniel joined the call from his workshop, where he was crafting a rocking chair designed specifically for the cabin's front porch. "I should have this finished by next week," he said, turning his laptop to show the nearly completed piece. "Dad's measurements were perfect. It'll fit the porch dimensions exactly." The rocking chair was beautiful, crafted from cherry wood, with details that reflected both Harold's design preferences and Daniel's growing skill as a woodworker. More importantly, it represented hours of time he'd invested in creating something specifically for my comfort and enjoyment. Amanda appeared last, her background showing the bustling kitchen of her catering facility where she was preparing for a weekend wedding. "The bride loved your muffin recipe, Mom. She wants to hire me for her anniversary party next year and specifically requested that you help with the menu planning." The recognition of my culinary expertise was gratifying, but Amanda's assumption that I'd be available and willing to collaborate was even more meaningful. She'd begun treating me as a valuable resource rather than a dependent burden. Exactly. The transformation Harold's plan had been designed to encourage. Our conversation ranged from business updates to personal reflections, covering topics that demonstrated how much our relationships had deepened over the past 3 months. Rebecca shared concerns about work-life balance. Daniel discussed his son's college planning, and Amanda talked about her growing confidence as a business owner and community leader. "I've been thinking about Dad's funeral," Amanda said suddenly, her tone becoming more reflective. "About how we left you there alone, and how that must have felt after everything you'd sacrificed for our success." The memory still stung, though. Time and reconciliation had reduced its emotional impact considerably. "It was a wake-up call for all of us," I replied gently. "Sometimes painful experiences force necessary changes that wouldn't occur under comfortable circumstances." Rebecca's expression grew serious. "We'd convinced ourselves that you'd become a burden, someone we needed to manage rather than someone we wanted to spend time with." The trust revelation made us realize how completely we'd misunderstood both your situation and your capabilities. Daniel nodded in agreement. "We'd created this narrative where you were the struggling widow who needed our help, when actually you were the successful woman who'd been testing our character and finding it lacking." Their acknowledgement of past failures was important, but I was more interested in their commitment to future growth than their guilt about previous mistakes. What matters is that we're all capable of change and that we've chosen to invest in rebuilding our relationships rather than simply accepting distance and dysfunction. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical matters like holiday planning and vacation coordination, along with deeper discussions about family values and personal priorities. By the time we ended the call, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from meaningful connection with people you love who also genuinely care about your well-being. That night, as I sat on the cabin's deck watching stars reflect on the dark water, I thought about Harold and the wisdom of his redemption plan. He'd understood that forcing his children to confront their failures while I was still alive to witness their growth would be more powerful than any posthumous punishment or reward. The money had provided motivation and opportunity, but the real transformation had come from their recognition that treating family members as burdens rather than blessings ultimately impoverished everyone involved. They'd learned that successful relationships require the same attention and investment as successful businesses, and that taking people for granted inevitably leads to losing them entirely. My phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel. "Thanks for the call tonight, Mom. I've been thinking about what Dad would say about how we've all changed over the past few months. I think he'd be proud of what we've accomplished together." The message brought tears to my eyes, partly from grief that Harold couldn't witness our family's renewal, but mostly from gratitude that his love and foresight had made such transformation possible. He'd given us a roadmap for redemption and the financial resources to follow it. But ultimately, each of us had chosen to do the difficult work of rebuilding trust and communication. Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away, but I was already looking forward to hosting my children and grandchildren at the cabin for our first holiday celebration in nearly 2 years. Amanda was planning the menu with input from everyone. Rebecca was coordinating travel logistics, and Daniel was building additional seating for the expanded gathering. More importantly, we were all approaching the celebration with genuine excitement rather than obligatory attendance. The cabin would be filled with family members who actually enjoyed each other's company, who valued each other's contributions, and who understood that maintaining relationships requires ongoing effort and attention. As I prepared for bed in the peaceful sanctuary Harold and I had created together, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me from abandonment to renewal. The past 3 months had proven that it's never too late to demand respect, never too late to change family dynamics, and never too late to discover that the people you love are capable of growing into better versions of themselves. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for connection and growth, along with the ongoing work of maintaining relationships that had been rebuilt rather than simply inherited. But tonight, surrounded by the natural beauty Harold and I had always loved and sustained by the knowledge that our children had chosen love over convenience, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing that some stories really can have happy endings. The trust would continue to provide security and opportunity for future generations. But its greatest value had been in forcing us to confront the difference between financial inheritance and emotional legacy. Money could be accumulated and distributed, but the relationships we'd rebuilt would endure long after the last trust distribution had been made. Harold's final gift to our family hadn't been the money itself, but the wisdom to use that money as a tool for bringing us back together rather than driving us apart. In forcing his children to choose between inheritance and relationship, he'd taught them that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased or inherited. They had to be earned through love, respect, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. As sleep overtook me in the peaceful cabin where our family would soon gather to celebrate both gratitude and renewal, I felt Harold's presence surrounding me like a warm embrace, his love and foresight having created the foundation for healing that I'd feared might never come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.